He believed her. The words were not spoken aloud. They were a shard of ice lodged in her soul, a truth so cold and absolute it had frozen her from the inside out 5 years ago. And here he was, Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood, standing in the doorway of her small, sea-battered cottage, his presence so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He looked older, lines of torment carved around the familiar gray eyes that were a mirror of her son's. The sight of him was a physical blow, a ghost stepping out of a nightmare into the fragile piece she had painstakingly built from ash and sea salt. 5 years. 5 years of scrubbing other people's floors, of fine needlework until her fingers were raw, of rising before the sun to fetch water and mend nets for fishermen who paid her in coin that smelled of brine and honest labor. 5 years of being Mrs. Eames, a widow with a quiet son and a past she never spoke of. 5 years of freedom that tasted like poverty and exhaustion, but was freedom nonetheless. Now the architect of her ruin stood on her threshold, his fine wool coat splattered with the mud of Oakhaven's unpaved lanes, a single leather glove clutched in his hand. The other, she knew, was tucked safely in her son's pocket, the glove that had brought this apocalypse to her door. Ilara, he breathed, and her name on his lips was a desecration. It was the name of a pampered, naive girl who believed in the sanctity of a vow. Mrs. Eames had no use for that name. She did not invite him in. She simply stood there, a human bulwark, between him and the small back room, where Leo was playing with his carved wooden soldiers. Her body was a shield. Her heart was a stone. This morning, the Duke of Blackwood's carriage had rolled through their insignificant village, a monstrous, lacquered beast that sent chickens scattering and children staring. He had ordered it to circle the village, never stopping, a silent, imperious patrol. Ilara had watched from her window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had prayed he was just passing through, a titan surveying some forgotten corner of his vast domain. But then, as the carriage rounded the corner near her cottage, a glove, buttery soft and rich with the scent of expensive leather, had tumbled from the window. And her son, her brave, beautiful Leo, with his father's eyes and her stubborn heart, had seen it. He had scooped it up and given chase, his small legs pumping, shouting after the grand conveyance until it finally, reluctantly, halted. Alistair had stared down from the carriage window, his face a mask of pale shock as he looked at the boy, at the eyes, the Blackwood eyes, unmistakable and damning. He had taken the glove, his fingers brushing his son's for a fleeting, catastrophic moment. He had asked the boy his name and where he lived, and now he was here. The past had caught her. "What do you want?" Her voice was rough, scraped raw by disuse in the face of such soul-shattering memories. It was the voice of Mrs. Eames, not the Duchess of Blackwood. To talk, to explain. His voice, once so assured and resonant in the halls of Parliament, was hesitant, broken. A bitter laugh almost escaped her. Explain? Could he explain away the icy contempt in his eyes that night? The quiet, clinical cruelty of his judgment? Could he explain how easily he had discarded her, their marriage, their future, based on the venomous whispers of his aunt? No. Some things could not be explained. They could only be endured. "There is nothing to explain," she said, her voice flat. "You made your judgment 5 years ago. I have lived with it. Now I must ask you to leave. You are disturbing the peace." She saw the flicker of the old ducal arrogance in his eyes, the ingrained expectation of obedience. It was swiftly replaced by a raw, desperate pain that was almost more offensive. She did not want his pain. She did not want his regret. It was currency she could no longer spend. "I will not leave," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "Not until you have heard me. I was a fool, Ilara. A blind, arrogant fool. I was deceived." "You were a husband," she countered, the words finally sharp, finally hers. And you failed. Now get off my property before I call the constable." It was a hollow threat. The constable was a portly man who was more concerned with smuggled brandy than domestic disputes. But the Duke did not know that. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the wreckage of their shared history, the ghost of a love she had once believed would be her sanctuary. He had not just broken her heart. He had razed the very ground upon which it was built, and he had no right at all, to trespass on the ruins. The gilded cage had been the Duke's London residence, a monument of pale stone and suffocating silence on a prestigious square. In her first year as his Duchess, Elara had felt less a wife and more a curator of a museum dedicated to the Blackwood legacy. Her days were governed by the tyrannical ticking of a multitude of ancestral clocks, each one measuring out a life that felt increasingly disconnected from her own pulse. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the faint, funereal perfume of hothouse lilies that were replaced daily, their vibrant life a fleeting mockery of the stagnation within the walls. Alistair was a phantom in his own home, a duke, a politician, a man burdened by the weight of 1,000 duties that did not include the emotional care of his young wife. He was polite, impeccably so. He would inquire after her health at breakfast, his gaze already on the stack of correspondence by his plate. He would compliment her gown at dinner, his mind clearly occupied with a debate in the House of Lords. He moved through their life with a detached, aristocratic grace that left her feeling utterly, profoundly alone. She was another of his possessions, more valuable than a prize mare, but less interesting than a political treatise. Pervar. He was not cruel, not in the way of villains in novels. His was a cruelty of omission, of a deep and abiding apathy that was somehow more wounding than outright malice. He had married her because she was suitable. Good family, impeccable reputation, quiet demeanor. He had fulfilled his duty by providing a duchess for his title. He seemed to feel his obligations ended there. Her attempts to breach the wall of his reserve were met with a kind of baffled courtesy, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking to him. The oppression was not just in the silence, but in the eyes, the ever-present, ever-judging eyes of the staff, of society, and most pointedly, of his aunt, the Dowager Duchess Augusta. Augusta was a woman carved from granite and disapproval. She had managed Alistair's life since his parents' death, and she viewed Elara's presence as a necessary but regrettable intrusion. Her words were always coated in a thin veneer of solicitude, but the meaning beneath was pure acid. "My dear, you look a touch pale," she would say, her eyes scanning Elara's simple gown with faint contempt. "The city air does not agree with the delicate country constitution, I find. One must be bred for it." The implication was always clear. Elara was not. Augusta was the high priestess of the Blackwood cult, and Alistair was her oblivious deity. She would murmur her poison into his ear, cloaked as concern. She spoke of Elara's artistic sensibilities as if they were a moral failing, her patronage of a young, struggling painter a sign of frivolousness unbefitting a duchess. "One must be careful, Alistair. Such people can be so opportunistic. A woman of her station must be above reproach, for your sake." Elara saw it happening. She felt the net of Augusta's creation tightening around her, but she was powerless. To complain to Alistair would be to seem hysterical, jealous. He respected his aunt implicitly. Her word was gospel. Elara's was merely the whisper of a woman he barely knew. She was drowning in the gilded cage, and the one person who held the key was the one who could not see the bars. Her loneliness was a physical entity, a cold presence that shared her cavernous bed at night. She began to feel herself disappearing, fading into the damask wallpaper, her own thoughts dissolving into the oppressive quiet. The shattering came on a Tuesday, a dreary, rain-lashed evening that mirrored the landscape of her soul. Alistair had been away for a week, and upon his return, Augusta had immediately sequestered him in his study. Elara had waited in the drawing room, a book lying unread in her lap, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. She had known for 2 days that she was with child. The knowledge was a terrifying, precious secret, a tiny spark of warmth in the vast coldness of her life. She had planned to tell him that night, hoping, with a naivety she would later despise, that it might be the key to unlocking some hidden tenderness in him. He entered the room an hour later. The door clicked shut behind him with a sound of finality, like a coffin lid being sealed. He did not approach her. He stood by the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, and it was a mask of cold, righteous fury. It was the most emotion she had ever seen on his features, and it was directed, with the force of a physical assault, at her. "I have been made aware," he began, his voice devoid of all warmth, a blade of polished ice, "of the true nature of your patronage, of your relationship with this painter." She froze. The book slid from her lap and hit the Aubusson carpet with a soft, muffled thud. "Alistair, what are you talking about?" "Do not play the innocent with me," he bit out. "Augusta has been concerned for some time. I dismissed her fears as overcautious. I was wrong." He held up a letter. "This was found in your writing desk. It is from him. It is quite descriptive." Her mind reeled. A letter. She had never received such a letter. She had met with the artist, Mr. Finch, only ever in public galleries or with her maid present. She had bought 2 of his landscapes. That was the extent of it. "I don't understand," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Let me see it." "No," he said, his voice absolute. He crumpled it in his fist and threw it into the fire. The paper flared, a brief, bright agony, and then was gone. "I will not have his filth sully your hands further. I have already had the man dealt with. He will not trouble you again." The clinical detachment of his words was more horrifying than any shouting would have been. He had already passed sentence. He had held the trial in his study with Augusta as the sole witness and prosecutor. Alara was not even to be granted the dignity of a defense. The world went silent. The roar of the fire, the drumming of the rain against the tall windows, the frantic beating of her own heart, it all faded into a profound, echoing void. There was only his face, etched in disgust and betrayal, and the sickening, soul-crushing realization that he believed it. He had known her for a year, had shared her bed, had taken her vows before God, and yet the word of his aunt, coupled with a piece of paper she was not even allowed to see, was enough to utterly annihilate her. The accusation was a wound, but his belief in it was the poison that would make it fatal. "Alistair," she said, her voice a thread. The secret of their child was a stone in her throat. How could she tell him now? How could she bring a baby into this house, to be raised by a father who believed its mother a whore? To be clutched at by the venomous claws of the woman who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. "You will remain in your rooms," he commanded, his voice flat and final. "We will maintain appearances, for the sake of the title. But as of this moment, you are no longer my wife. You are merely a presence in my house. Do you understand?" She did not scream. She did not cry or faint or plead. A duchess did not make scenes. A part of her, the part that had been slowly dying for a year, simply gave up. She rose from her chair, her movements stiff and automatic, like a clockwork doll. She looked at him one last time, at the handsome stranger who wore her husband's face, and felt nothing but a vast, desolate emptiness. The ice in her soul had finally extinguished the last ember of hope. She nodded once, a small, jerky movement. Then she turned and walked from the room, her back straight, her head held high, the performance of a lifetime. She did not look back. That night, huddled in the cold expanse of her canopied bed, the decision formed not as a thought, but as a primal instinct for survival. She could not stay. To remain would be to slowly petrify, to become another silent portrait on the wall, her spirit eroding day by day under the weight of his contempt and Augusta's smug triumph. But it was not just for herself. It was for the tiny, nascent life inside her. This child, her child, would not be born into a prison of lies. This child would be born into freedom, even if that freedom was harsh and cold and unforgiving. Action was an antidote to despair. In the deep pre-dawn hours, while the great house slept, she moved with a quiet, desperate purpose. She did not pack a trunk. A trunk was for a journey from which one intended to return. She took a single, sturdy carpet bag. Into it went the plainest dress she owned, a dark wool serviceable for travel, and a thick shawl. She bypassed the jewel case on her dressing table, its contents glittering like captured stars. The blackwood diamonds felt like shackles, each facet a reflection of her gilded cage. They belonged to the Duchess, and she was shedding that title like a snake sheds its skin. Instead, she retrieved a small, locked cash box from the bottom of her wardrobe. It contained the last of her dowry, a modest sum her father had insisted she keep for her own use. It was not a fortune, but it was hers. It was untainted. It was the price of her escape. She looked around the opulent room one last time. The silk wallpaper, the ridiculously ornate furniture, the portrait of some long-dead, grim-faced Beaumont ancestor glowering down at her. It was not a home. It was a mausoleum, and she refused to be buried in it. Stripped of her finery, dressed in the drab clothes of a common traveler, she looked at her reflection in the grand cheval mirror. The Duchess was gone. In her place was a woman, frightened, determined, and utterly alone. Slipping out of the house was surprisingly easy. The servants were asleep, the watchman dozing in his hut by the main gate. The city was a labyrinth of dark, sleeping streets. She did not take a cab. She walked, her bag heavy in her hand, melting into the shadows, heading for the coaching inn on the far side of the city, the one that served the routes to the coast. Every step was a severance, a cutting of the 1,000 invisible threads that had bound her to that life. With each block she put between herself and the stone monument of her marriage, she felt the ice inside her begin to thaw, replaced by the hot, fierce, terrifying pulse of survival. She was no longer a duchess. She was no longer a wife. She was a mother, and that was all that mattered. 5 years later, the woman known as Alara Eames stood at her cottage window, watching the tide roll in. Oakhaven was a world away from the suffocating grandeur of London. Here, the air tasted of salt and wood smoke, not perfume and polish. The sounds were the cry of gulls and the rhythmic crash of waves, not the oppressive ticking of clocks. Her life was hard, a constant calculation of pennies and chores, but it was real. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now capable, chapped from lye soap, calloused from work, but strong. They could mend a fisherman's net, knead a loaf of bread, and hold her son's hand with a fierce, protective grip. Leo was the sun around which her small world orbited. He was a bright, inquisitive boy of 4, with a wild thatch of dark hair and his father's serious gray eyes. He knew nothing of dukes or London townhouses. His world was the rock pools on the beach, the stories his mother told him by the fire, and the kindness of their neighbor, Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable, the innkeeper's wife, was a stout woman with a shrewd gaze and a heart as big as the ocean. She had taken Alara under her wing when she had first arrived, a pale, haunted-looking young woman with a secret in her belly, and had never asked the questions that burned in her eyes. She had provided work, friendship, and a silent, unshakable loyalty that was worth more than all the Blackwood diamonds. Alara had found a strange, quiet contentment in this harsh, new reality. She had traded silk for rough-spun wool, servants for self-reliance, a title for an anonymous name. She had thought herself safe, the past buried so deep it could never be unearthed. She had been wrong. Meanwhile, in London, Duke Alistair Beaumont was drowning in the silence Alara had left behind. The great house, once merely quiet, was now sepulchral. Her absence was a palpable presence, a void that echoed in every room. He had expected relief, a righteous peace in the wake of her deserved banishment. Instead, there was only a hollow, aching emptiness. Augusta had tried to fill the void, pushing her preferred candidate, the simpering Lady Beatrice, into his path at every opportunity. But Beatrice's vapid chatter and grasping ambition only served to highlight what he had lost. Alara had been quiet, yes, but her silence had been thoughtful, observant. Beatrice's was the silence of an empty vessel. He found himself staring at the empty chair across the dining table, remembering the graceful curve of Alara's neck, the way she would look up from a book, her eyes full of a life he had never bothered to investigate. Doubt, at first a tiny, unwelcome splinter, began to fester. It started with the letter. He had burned it in a fit of rage, but phrases from it echoed in his memory, and they sounded wrong. The prose was too florid, too melodramatic. It sounded less like a passionate artist and more like a character from one of Augusta's cheap novels. Then there was the matter of the artist himself, Mr. Finch. Alistair had paid the man a handsome sum to disappear to the continent and had thought the matter closed. But a chance remark from a fellow lord about Finch's sudden, inexplicable wealth in Italy planted a seed of unease. The final crack in his certainty came a year after Alara's departure. He was going through some of her abandoned things, a task he had put off, unable to face it. In a small, forgotten box, he found a sheaf of her letters to her sister. He read them, feeling like a trespasser, a voyeur. Her voice rose from the pages, witty, intelligent, and desperately lonely. She wrote of her attempts to connect with him, her frustrations with the stifling formality of her new life, her admiration for Mr. Finch's landscapes. It was the writing of a thoughtful, sensitive woman, not a duplicitous adulteress. The tone was utterly at odds with the flowery, incriminating prose of the letter he had burned. The splinter of doubt became a shard of agony. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant, monumental fool, manipulated by the one person he had trusted implicitly. The realization did not come like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, creeping poison, sickening him from the inside. He had condemned his wife, the mother of the child he now suspected she might have been carrying, on the flimsiest of evidence, all because it confirmed the subtle narrative of her unsuitability that Augusta had been spinning for a year. He hired a man named Thorne, a former barrister known for his discretion and tenacity. He gave him a simple, devastating task: find the truth of what happened 5 years ago, and find the Duchess of Blackwood. Thorne was ruthlessly efficient. He tracked down the forger who had penned the letter, a man deep in his cups and his debts, who confessed Augusta had paid him well. He found the maid Augusta had bribed to plant it. He traveled to Italy and found Mr. Finch, who, riddled with guilt and a wasting sickness, gave a full account of the Dowager Duchess's scheme. It was a web of deceit, meticulously woven, and Alistair had walked right into the center of it. Each new revelation was another turn of the knife in his gut. The final report from Thorne included an address, a cottage in a fishing village named Oakhaven, a Mrs. Eames. Thorne included a description of the woman and her young son, a boy with dark hair and startlingly familiar gray eyes. Hope and terror warred within Alistair, a sickening, dizzying combination. He traveled to Oakhaven not in a blaze of ducal authority, but like a penitent on a pilgrimage to a shrine he had desecrated. He ordered his carriage to circle the village, desperate for a glimpse, terrified of what he might find. He saw her through the window of a small cottage, her profile bent over her sewing. She was thinner, her face etched with a maturity and a weariness that tore at him, but she was unmistakably Alara. His Alara, the woman he had wronged more grievously than any man could wrong a woman. And then came the glove, the fumble, the fall, the sight of a small boy running toward the carriage. The world had tilted on its axis when he looked into that child's face. It was his own face, mirrored back at him from 2 generations past. It was the face of the first Duke of Blackwood, from the portrait in the long gallery. It was the face of his son, his heir. the boy he had cast out into the wilderness along with his mother. The glove in his hand felt like a lead weight. The boy's small, warm fingers brushing his had felt like a brand, which led him here, to her doorstep, facing the cold, unyielding fury in her eyes. "You were a husband," she had said, "and you failed." The simple, brutal truth of it stripped him of all defense. "I know," he said, his voice raw. He took a half step back from the doorway, a small concession of space, a sign he would not force his way in. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. God knows I have not earned it. I am asking for 5 minutes of your time, to present the facts, not as an excuse, as a confession." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant cry of gulls and the faint sound of a child's laughter from within the cottage. The sound twisted the knife in Alistair's gut. He had missed it all. The first steps, the first words, the laughter. He had traded it all for his aunt's approval and his own damnable pride. "Leo," she called over her shoulder, her voice softening for a moment as she addressed her son. "Stay in your room for a moment, my love. Mama needs to speak to the man." Then her eyes hardened again as she looked back at Alistair. 5 minutes, on the porch. You are not coming into my home." He nodded, grateful for even this meager offering. He felt like a beggar pleading for scraps at the gates of a castle he once owned. He followed her out onto the small, wind-scoured porch and began the agonizing task of telling her the truth, the whole, sordid, shameful truth of his own blindness. He laid it all out for her: Thorne's investigation, the forger, the bribed maid, the confession from the artist in Italy. He spoke in a low, flat monotone, stripping the account of all emotion, presenting only the facts of his aunt's betrayal and his own catastrophic failure to question it. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not try to soften the blow of his own idiocy. He confessed his sins to her like a man on the gallows. Alara listened without interruption, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a stone mask. The sea breeze whipped strands of hair around her face, but she did not move. When he was finished, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. He had given her the truth, but the truth did not change the past. The truth did not erase 5 years of hardship, 5 years of her believing he thought her worthless. "So she lied," Alara said finally, her voice still devoid of warmth. "And you believed her. The facts have not changed, Your Grace. You simply have a more convenient villain now. It does not absolve you." "I am not looking for absolution," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know what I'm looking for. A chance to atone." "There is no atonement for this," she said, turning her head to look out at the gray, churning sea. "You destroyed my life. I built a new one, a better one, a real one. We do not need you. We do not want you. Go back to your hollow life, Your Grace, and leave us to our real one." "I can't," he whispered. "He is my son." Her head snapped back, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "He is my son. I kept him safe. I kept him fed. I raised him. Where were you? You have no claim on him. You forfeited that right the moment you threw his mother away like so much trash." Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, and he accepted each one as his due. He deserved this. He deserved all of it. "I will not leave Oakhaven," he stated, a quiet resolve hardening his voice. It was not a demand. It was a statement of fact. "I will not force myself on you or the boy, but I will be here. If you need anything. If he needs anything." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Need anything? What could you possibly offer us, Your Grace? Money? We have learned to live without it. A title for Leo? You would subject him to the same viper's nest that you allowed to poison you? No, thank you. We need nothing from you." She turned and went back inside the cottage, closing the door firmly in his face. The click of the latch was as final as a gunshot. Alistair stood on the porch for a long time, the sea wind chilling him to the bone, staring at the weathered wood of the door that separated him from everything he now realized he had ever truly wanted. He had not just lost a wife, he had lost himself, and the long, arduous journey to find his way back had just begun. Alistair was true to his word. He did not leave. He did not pound on her door or send emissaries. He rented 2 rooms above the pub Mrs. Gable ran with her husband, to the profound shock and awe of the entire village. The Duke of Blackwood, sleeping in a lumpy bed that smelled faintly of ale and fried fish, became the single greatest topic of gossip Oakhaven had ever known. He did not approach Alara or Leo again directly. Instead, he began a quiet, methodical campaign of penance. He learned from Mr. Gable that the old forge at the edge of the village had been shut for a year, putting 3 families out of work. Alistair bought it. He hired a master smith from the city, paid him a handsome wage, and reopened it, hiring back the 3 local men and 2 apprentices. He did it all through his solicitor, his name never officially attached. But in a village the size of Oakhaven, secrets were sand through a sieve. Everyone knew. Alara heard it from Mrs. Gable, whose brother was one of the men re-employed at the forge. "He's a strange one, your Duke," the innkeeper's wife said, her hands busy polishing glasses. "Throws money around like it's water, but not on himself. Eats the same stew as everyone else in the tap room and hasn't said a word of complaint about the mattress. Says it's better than he deserves." Alara said nothing, but she watched. From her window, she saw him walking the shoreline in the early mornings, a solitary, brooding figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He looked lost, a man utterly adrift. She saw the village children, at first wary of the grand London gentleman, begin to lose their fear. He never approached them, but he would leave a shilling on a stump near where they played, or have a basket of sweets delivered to the small schoolhouse. One afternoon, a storm blew in, a fierce gale that rattled the windows and tore at the roof of her small cottage. A loose shutter banged against the wall, the rhythm a frantic, maddening drum. She had tried to fix it herself, but the latch was beyond her skill. As she struggled with it on a rickety ladder in the driving rain, a figure appeared out of the deluge. It was Alistair. He didn't speak. He simply took the hammer from her hand, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He gestured for her to get down, and then he climbed the ladder, his fine coat soaked through, and methodically, expertly, fixed the shutter. He worked in silence, the only sounds the wind, the rain, and the sharp taps of the hammer. When he was done, he tested it to ensure it was secure, then climbed down. He looked at her, his face streaming with water, his gray eyes full of an apology he knew he had no right to speak. He just nodded, turned, and walked back into the storm. Alara stood there, drenched and trembling, long after he was gone. It was a small thing, fixing a shutter, but it was not a grand gesture. It was not an attempt to buy her. It was an act of service, simple and direct. It was a crack in the wall of her anger, a tiny, treacherous fissure. A week later, a packet arrived for her, delivered by a nervous-looking boy from the inn. It was not from Alistair, but from his solicitor in London, Mr. Thorne. Inside was a thick sheaf of documents. There were sworn affidavits from the forger and the maid, a signed, witnessed confession from Mr. Finch, sent from his deathbed in Italy, and at the bottom a copy of a legal document. It was a deed of exile. Alistair had formally banished Augusta to a remote, dreary estate in the northernmost part of the country. He had stripped her of her title as Dowager Duchess and cut off her access to the main Blackwood fortune. He had, in the cold, precise language of the law, utterly destroyed the woman who had destroyed their lives. He had not sent it with a note. He had not presented it himself. He had simply sent the proof, the truth, laid bare and undeniable. He was not asking her to forgive him. He was showing her that he had held the guilty party to account, and in doing so had acknowledged his own role as her enabler. Alara sat at her small kitchen table and read the documents over and over again, the cold, hard facts of her vindication a bitter pill to swallow. It changed everything, and it changed nothing. The turning point came, as it so often does, not with a grand declaration, but with a child's fever. Leo fell ill in the dead of winter. It started as a cough, then worsened into a fever that left him delirious and weak. The village doctor, a kindly but aged man, did what he could, but the fever raged on. Alara sat by his bedside for 3 days and nights, wiping his brow with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, her heart a knot of pure terror. Mrs. Gable came and went, bringing broth and sitting with her. But on the third night, as Leo's breathing became shallow and ragged, Alara felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. She was alone, utterly alone in her fight for her son's life. As if summoned by her despair, there was a quiet knock on the door. It was Alistair. Mrs. Gable must have sent for him. He looked haggard, his face pale with sleeplessness. He did not ask to come in. He simply held out a small, canvas-wrapped package. "Quinine," he said, his voice a low rasp. "From the city. My man rode all night to fetch it. The doctor said it might help." She stared at the package, then at him. He had not waited. He had anticipated the need and acted. She stepped back from the door, a silent invitation. He entered the cottage for the first time, his large frame seeming to shrink in the small, humble space. He did not look around. His eyes went straight to the small bed in the corner, where Leo was tossing fitfully. He did not leave. He stayed through the long, dark hours of the night, sitting in the single other chair, a silent, watchful presence. He fetched water when she needed it. He rebuilt the fire when it dwindled to embers. He did not offer empty platitudes or false hope. He simply shared the vigil. When, in the darkest hour before the dawn, Alara finally broke, her body racked with silent, exhausted sobs, he was there. He knelt beside her chair and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. He said nothing. He just held on, a human anchor in the storm of her fear. By morning, the fever had broken. Leo was weak, but lucid, his gray eyes clear for the first time in days. He looked from his mother's tired face to the strange, tall man sitting by the fire. "Mama," he whispered, "the glove man is here." Alistair flinched at the name, but a small, weary smile touched Alara's lips. "Yes, my love, he is." Leo's illness had scoured away the last of her defenses. In the crucible of her fear for her son, she had seen the man Alistair had become. Not a duke, not a remote, arrogant figure of authority, but a man, a father, terrified for his child, a man who had stayed, who had shared her burden without asking for anything in return. After Leo was fully recovered, they began to talk, truly talk, for the first time. They walked on the beach, the winter wind whipping around them, and she told him of her life in Oakhaven, of the hardships and the small joys. He, in turn, told her of the echoing emptiness of his life after she had left, of the slow, dawning horror of his mistake. He spoke of his guilt not as a burden, but as a part of him now, a scar he would carry forever. "I cannot erase what I did, Alara," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I cannot give you back those 5 years. All I can do is spend the rest of my life proving that I am not the man I was." Forgiveness was not a moment. It was not a word she could grant him like a pardon. It was a slow, cautious process, like the turning of the tide. It was watching him teach Leo how to skip stones across the water. It was seeing the genuine joy on his face when their son laughed. It was the quiet respect with which he treated her, never assuming, never demanding, always asking. He was courting her, not as a duchess he was entitled to, but as Mrs. Eames, a woman he had to earn. She made the choice one spring afternoon. Leo was running along the beach, chasing sandpipers, his laughter carried on the breeze. Alistair was watching him, and the love on his face was so naked, so profound, it stole her breath. He had earned this. He had earned the right to be a father to his son, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had earned the right to try to be a husband to his wife again. "Alistair," she said quietly. He turned to her, his expression hopeful but guarded. "I am willing to try," she said, "on my terms." They did not return to London immediately. They stayed in Oakhaven through the summer, living in the cottage, learning how to be a family. Alistair taught Leo to read using newspapers and penny dreadfuls. Alara taught Alistair how to darn a sock and how to tell when the fish in the market was fresh. They were small, mundane lessons in a life that was finally, blessedly real. When they did return to Blackwood House, it was a different place. Alara ordered the heavy velvet curtains torn down, letting sunlight flood the once gloomy rooms. She filled the house with flowers from the country, their scent fresh and wild, not cloying and funereal. Laughter, Leo's bright, childish laughter, now echoed in the halls that had once held only silence. Alara did not resume the life of a society duchess. With Alistair's unconditional support and funding, she established a foundation, a charity dedicated to helping women who found themselves in desperate circumstances, women like the one she had been. She used her name and her position not as a shield, but as a tool, fighting for those who had no one else to fight for them. She had found her purpose, not as an accessory to a duke, but as a force in her own right. Alistair watched her, his heart filled with a pride and a love that was deeper and more real than anything he had ever known. He was no longer just a duke. He was Alara's husband and Leo's father. It was a title he cherished more than any other. The story ended not in a grand ballroom, but in the sprawling, slightly overgrown gardens of their country estate, far from the city. It was a warm autumn evening, the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, was on his hands and knees in the dirt, his fine trousers stained with grass, engaged in a mock ferocious battle with his son over a wooden sword. Leo's shrieks of laughter were the only music. Alara sat on a nearby bench, a book forgotten in her lap, simply watching them. A genuine smile graced her lips, erasing the last traces of the weary Mrs. Eames. The cage was gone. The ghosts were banished. The silence was filled with love. This was not a life she had been given. It was a life she had fought for, lost, and then, against all odds, rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before, on a new foundation of earned forgiveness and hard-won truth. It was, she knew, finally and truly, home.